Good morning. So I did two videos yesterday on the grooming gangs, but an awful lot has happened even since that point. So to recap, the first video I did was it was my first time sort of covering this. I've been following it, but it was my first time sort of covering this. Um, it was basically an overview of the grooming gangs, what had happened, and where we are now, and then um talked about the first two resignations of survivors from the liaison panel. I then did a second video because we had one of the prospective chairs resign or withdraw, and then we had a third survivor resign from the liaison panel. So, and then Jess Phillips was also in Parliament answering questions about this whole chaos. And some of her comments were wild. She said that basically the concerns raised by the actual survivors of grooming gangs who were, participating in this allegedly independent process was misinformation and false, essentially calling them liars. She denied she did that, but we all heard that. Um, she annoyed me, and I got uncharacteristically annoyed actually in my second video because she stood in Parliament and claimed that she has dedicated her whole life to victims. Um, she always listens to victims, always listens to victims. And I find that untrue because 4 years ago, sorry, she was the Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding. And I contacted her. I'd been through a nearly decade-long domestic violence situation with my former husband. I had a 4-year-long police investigation, which was about as incompetent as it gets. My ex-husband, one of the allegations was rape. They didn't go and arrest him. They tried to, basically let him decide when he was going to bother to show up. They invited him for a voluntary interview, and um it took about 15 months to get the first part of to get him to sit down for the first part of the interview. They weren't chasing him. It was, really was so relaxed and very much, well, you let us know when you're free and, we'll squeeze you in. The second part of the interview took a further 4 or 5 months. And they didn't collect evidence. They took my devices. They didn't take his, even though he had recorded himself raping me. And I called on Jess Phillips at the suggestion of victim support, various domestic abuse charities, even my own local MP, who was a Conservative. And I contacted her to ask for either with help with my situation or to effect some kind of change to prevent this happening to someone else. And my email, still to this day, 4 years later, has never been responded to. It's never been acknowledged. So it was absolutely infuriating for me. I thought, oh well, it's just an oversight, or she's just really busy. She's dealing with a lot of victims. Maybe she's dealing with a lot more serious victims than myself, like grooming gangs. Um, no, no, she doesn't listen. It's a pattern. It doesn't matter how serious or not serious the offence is, the abuse experiences. Um, she does not listen. So I rather angrily called her out on that. I'm glad I did. Needed to be said. I showed the email that I had sent to her, which went unanswered. But we had a lot more happen. So, this didn't happen yesterday, but it sort of come about, so I will touch on it now. One of the grooming gang inquiry advisors, Sabah Kaiser, has previously made comments suggesting that, in her words, brown men should not be blamed for the scandal. She also said claiming these crimes were committed by Asians was destructive, distracting, irresponsible, and not based on evidence. None of that's true. The men in these gangs are disproportionately Pakistani ethnicity. That is a fact. That is an evidential fact. And it's troubling when you have got people like this with these opinions and this kind of messaging sitting objectively, because they're clearly not being objective, but they're supposed to be objective, and they're sitting there on these panels advising, and yes, I'm doing air quotes. So that was the first thing that I wanted to just really kind of cover. Then a fourth survivor, resigned from Labour's grooming gang inquiry. And they cited a toxic environment for survivors. So this is just getting absolutely ridiculous. And I have Elizabeth Harper was the fourth person. I've got her resignation letter, so I'm going to read that as I have done the other ones. Dear members of the panel, it is with a heavy heart that I'm resigning as a participant in the National Inquiry Survivors Panel. I have always believed in truth, transparency, and justice for survivors. However, I am deeply concerned that there still isn't a genuine understanding of the grooming gangs scandal, nor the lasting trauma it has caused. Far too often, survivors like myself continue to be suppressed and silenced. It feels as though this remains one of Britain's darkest secrets. In my own case, I was silenced from 2002 to 2014, 12 long years, until the J report on Rotherham finally confirmed what we had been saying all along, that we were always telling the truth. What is happening now feels like a cover-up of a cover-up. It has created a toxic environment for survivors, filled with pressures that we should not have to deal with. Increasingly, I've seen selective narratives being promoted, ones that appear to serve particular agendas, especially around issues of race and the narrative of widening the scope. This approach risks distorting the realities of what happened and once again marginalizing the survivors whose voices should be at the very center of this work. I am also increasingly concerned about perceived conflicts of interest within the inquiry. Many survivors fear that political influences may already be embedded in its structure. Such perceptions undermine public trust and raise serious questions about the inquiry's independence. Furthermore, the recent departure of Annie Hudson has added to these worries. Survivors are left wondering whether important issues and decisions will continue to receive the scrutiny they deserve. Transparency and accountability are essential if the inquiry is to maintain credibility. More and more, I have begun to feel that much of this process is scripted and predetermined, as though outcomes are being shaped in advance rather than emerging from honest, open dialogue with survivors. This sense of control and stage management has left many of us questioning whether our voices truly matter, or whether we are being used to legitimize decisions that have already been made. Many of us feel that we are being silenced once again, and by remaining part of this process, I fear that I am becoming complicit in the continued suppression of survivors' voices. I joined this panel in the hope of helping to bring real change, to ensure that no survivor would ever again have to fight to be heard. Sadly, I am no longer believe that this panel is delivering the truth, transparency, and accountability that survivors deserve. I will always stand for truth and justice, and I hope that one day survivors, victims, and their families will see that day when we no longer have to fight to be believed. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute, and I sincerely hope the inquiry, the NWG, and the Home Office take these concerns to heart and act with the courage and integrity that survivors deserve. And that's from Elizabeth Harper. And it says so much when 4 survivors on this panel have resigned within 24 to 48 hours. Something is very wrong. So what else have we got? So if we go back as well to Jess Phillips, because this was quite I'll play this actually. Bear with me, sorry, I'm just pulling it up. Okay.
I'm suggesting that I will listen completely and utterly to the feedback from the victims that were and still are on. That they are not spreading misinformation at all, but his interpretation is a brilliant case in point, because I will be completely honest, the conversation with Oldham is, do we not think it might be better for them just to take part in a statutory inquiry? That it is absolutely nothing to do with the idea that Oldham is telling me what to do. And the more people from that side, he can hold up his paper and have a smug face all he likes, but the fact of the matter is that there is absolutely no council in this country who will tell this inquiry where it can and cannot go. I have said that 1,000,000 times from this dispatch box, and yet the same thing gets peddled again and again.
Thank you, Mr.
The victims of these crimes were vulnerable children who were ignored and who were gaslit and who were dismissed. 2 women have now resigned, 2 victims have now resigned because of this process and their lack of failure in the process. And yet what I hear from the Minister appears to me to be an aggressive and defensive tone. Yeah. Does she regret the fact? Is she going to listen? Remember these people are watching, is she going to listen to the victims? And does she regret that these 2 individuals have resigned from the process?
I absolutely regret that they have resigned from the process that, funnily enough,
so Jess Phillips there answering.
So, yeah, that was a bit of a car crash. Where is it? Is it here? So, in response to these comments from Jess Phillips denying that the scope was, there was an attempt to widen the scope, Fiona Goddard actually issued a further statement to Jess Phillips. And I've got this here. So, last night, Jess Phillips, the Minister for Safeguarding, in charge of much of the ongoing inquiry into group-based CSE, released a statement largely in reaction to my resignation from the Victim Survivors panel yesterday. When I resigned from the panel, I cited serious concerns that myself and other survivors have about 1. The expansion of the inquiry scope beyond grooming gangs, 2. Pushes for the inquiry to have a more regional focus and not be truly national. Instead of addressing these concerns, Jess Phillips has said that these suggestions are categorically untrue. This is a lie. The first time concerns were raised around expansion of the inquiry scope beyond grooming gangs was during a meeting where survivors of all kinds of child sexual exploitation, not just grooming gangs, were invited to a meeting with the Mayor of West Yorkshire to discuss the terms of reference for the national inquiry. In this meeting, both myself and the Keighley MP Robbie Moore flagged concerns that whilst every survivor of CSE deserves to be heard, this inquiry is meant to be narrow and purely focused on grooming gangs alone. Later, I was invited to join the Victim Survivor panel to help steer the terms of reference for the inquiry. Again, this panel included many survivors of CSE not related to grooming gangs. On this panel, it was noteworthy that only survivors who were not impacted by grooming gangs and those that we knew had close relations to Jess Phillips were the only people pushing for the scope of the inquiry to be pushed to all kinds of CSE. Shortly after I was added to the panel, I got an email saying that we were to be consulted on the terms of reference, and one of the questions on the agenda was, should the inquiry have an explicit focus on grooming gangs or group-based CSEA, or take a broader approach? It is a blatant lie for Jess Phillips to suggest, as she has done in her letter, that it is untrue that there has been possibility or conversation around expanding the scope beyond grooming gangs. Jess Phillips also denies that the government has sought to take a regional approach to investigations. This is also a lie. In the meeting with the Mayor of West Yorkshire, mentioned earlier, Alison Lowe, the Deputy Mayor, said that she did not want a review anywhere in West Yorkshire, and Bradford is in the West Yorkshire. Though she later changed her position, no truly national review would entertain the idea of having areas opt out of investigation, especially an area like Bradford, which is one of the worst affected and least investigated areas blighted by grooming gangs. It was particularly concerning to see this so actively pushed for by a Labour official. Baroness Casey set out firm recommendations in her audit around both of these issues: group-based CSE and a national overview with in-depth investigation into localities with high levels of evidence of failings in proportion with the amount of survivors. The government said they accepted the recommendations in full from her audit, yet both the main things have been questioned. I then raised my concerns with Jess Phillips through private text, as did other survivors. Jess replied to the survivors, stating she believes the inquiry should just focus on grooming gangs, but that she couldn't decide that without consulting more widely first. So for Phillips to suggest that any accusations of the scope being expanded past grooming gangs or localities is untrue is a lie, and she knows it. She even confirmed herself that they needed to consult on the scope being expanded. Certain things around the terms of reference certainly need consulting on, but many of the most fundamental aspects, the fact that this would be a national inquiry with mandatory statutory investigations into key areas with a narrow focus on grooming gangs, were already confirmed during the announcement of this inquiry, and their importance was cemented by Baroness Casey. They should have been set in stone. Promising one thing publicly to the nation, then secretly consulting on if they needed changing, is wrong. And she's absolutely right. As a grooming gang survivor, I have been accused of lying by public institutions for years in an attempt to cover up and deny the abuse of myself and thousands of others. For the minister in charge of safeguarding to come out against me and accuse me of lying is an absolute betrayal of myself and all survivors. I am surprised that Phillips would say this when she knows for a fact there have been extended conversations about the inquiry's scope and regional focuses. I had let myself hope that maybe this time would be different, that these officials might actually tell the truth. I won't be making that mistake again. That's some really strong words. And Fiona has actually put up the questions and the text messages. So, here are the questions for reflection. These were sent to the survivors. Question 1: What do you most want the inquiry to achieve? What areas should it focus on? 2: Are there specific questions or issues you believe the inquiry must address? 3: Should the inquiry have an explicit focus on grooming gangs or group-based CSEA, or take a broader approach? Well, that's pretty, explanatory. Like, that proves categorically Jess Phillips was lying. 4: Who do you think the inquiry needs to speak to in local areas to fully understand what happened? How should it choose which local areas to focus on? Again, proves another lie. That's not the definition of a national inquiry. 5: How can the inquiry best involve and engage victims and survivors throughout its work? What would help you feel safe and supported in sharing your experiences? Well, telling the fucking truth for a start would probably go some way. 6: What does justice or accountability look like to you as part of this inquiry? Well, at this point, justice and accountability to me would look like Jess Phillips resigning. I think these are meeting minutes by the looks of it. And we can see highlighted here, Alison Lowe. I do not want a review anywhere in West Yorkshire, and Bradford is obviously in West Yorkshire. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So here's the text messages. And absolutely amazing job by Fiona Goddard for, making all of this stuff public. So here's the message she sends to Jess Phillips. I don't think it's, I don't know if it's complete, or it might be complete. Sorry to message again, but if it's supposed to be about grooming gangs, why has the charity that the Home Office has set up to consult with survivors just sent out the agenda for the questions that are going to be asked? And one is, should this be a grooming gang inquiry or group-based CSE, or should this take a broader approach? Every which way, this has been manipulated away from what it was supposed to be, and it's unfair. I'm about ready to give up on this inquiry already. Bless her, she sounds exasperated. And rightly so. So Jess Phillips's response here, only just picking it up. I don't want you to misunderstand. The reason for the question is because there have been differing views, and we want you to be able to give a clear steer on what you want. I know it's hard to trust, but I can promise you no one is trying to manipulate the response. you just called her a liar for putting this in her resignation letter. And it is my view that it is only a grooming gang specific inquiry, but it is not right for me to make that decision without it being formally consulted on. I mean, this is just scraping the barrel of ridiculousness. It's in complete chaos. How can anyone have faith or trust? And having been a victim of a different type of abuse, but if all of this was happening and I was part of this, I would not have faith. I would have resigned by now. I mean, the people who have resigned, amazing. And to speak out and defend yourselves against people who should be protecting you. I've been there, and it just causes further trauma. You're already in a state of you don't know who to trust. So this morning's news, unsurprisingly, is Jess Phillips is facing demands to quit after her rather aggressive performance yesterday. And she had to admit that trust with the victims is broken. Well, where do you go from that? How can you objectively conduct an inquiry of this nature when even the survivors don't trust you? And they don't, that's not come from nowhere. They don't trust you because they have been part of the process and they have seen and heard for themselves how it is being handled behind closed doors. And they've given us all a very vivid descriptions. And now we don't trust you to get this right. So next I was going to just go through this. Now this is Ellie Reynolds. She was the second person to resign, and she is doing an interview, and it's just a short clip, but I find what she said so incredibly interesting.
Of people responsible for this were Muslim men of Pakistani origin. As I understand it, you wanted to sort of laser focus on that, and you got the feeling that this inquiry, as it was unfolding, didn't want to do that. They wanted to widen the remit so that the finger wasn't pointed at Muslim men of Pakistani origin. Would that be a fair summary of what was concerning you?
Yeah, absolutely. In mine and a few others' opinions, there was already the ICSA that widened the panel, and we really wanted to be able to crack down on rape gangs here that are predominantly Muslim males. We felt almost like we had to tiptoe around that subject, though we became quite fearful, really, of describing what ethnicity our abusers were, and it should never get to that. However, you have to look at the lady that was running the panel along with the Home Office. She was an ethnic minority ambassador, so I don't believe personally that she was ever pro-victims, pro-survivors in this case. Everyone that's on these panels are very biased. They're not impartial. They're not for the survivors. I think it was a way to find out what survivors knew, what they were going to raise, and how they could cover it up in the future.
Well said, Ellie. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read 3 paragraphs, your final 3 paragraphs of your resignation letter, because they're very powerful. You wrote to the inquiry, just such as it is at this stage. The final turning point for me was the push to change the remit, to widen it in ways that downplay the racial and religious motivations behind our abuse. For many of us, these were not incidental factors. They were central to why we were targeted and why institutions failed to act. To erase that truth is to rewrite history. I cannot take part in a process that manipulates survivors, censors our voices, and tries to...
So it was only a short clip, but basically, you know, you had a survivor basically saying that you couldn't talk about Muslim men, you couldn't talk about ethnicity, but, and rightly so, she points out, but that's integral to the entire circumstance. So to not be able to say it makes it impossible to investigate it. And for me, looking at this, you know, and again, it's not from a place of any racism or any religious prejudices. It's just stating facts. This feels like, you know, when we had you know, the issues with, you know, women kind of being forced to compromise their safety, their rights with trans women who were, you know, men who were claiming to transition to being women, no questions asked. And we had the absurd situations where, you know, rape victims had to use female pronouns to refer to their rapist in court. It's an incredibly unfair situation to be put in these people who have been subjected to horrendous ordeals by these men, to put them in a situation where the feelings of the men is the primary driver, is paramount. You know, and that is just unfair, completely and utterly unfair. And it's shameful that the government are letting these people down time and time again in both situations. In both in the situations with, you know, with rapists who transitioned very suddenly so they could get into a woman's prison. You know, seeing victims being forced to refer to them as women, being forced to say in court, she raped me with her penis. It defies all logic and common sense. And for here now, people, the overriding concern is we cannot offend a particular religious group or a particular ethnic group, even though they are the perpetrators. And again, that's not aimed blanket at everyone from those particular religious or ethnic groups, but at the ones who actually committed these offences. And the problem is when you have got, like she said, the ethics minister saying things like, well, we can't put the blame on brown men for this, when they are specifically the ones to blame. The evidence shows that. You got the Home Secretary, who is also of an ethnic minority. It calls into question, you know, the London mayor as well, like, who still to this day does not know what a grooming gang is, even though he's the police and crime commissioner. Neither does his deputy, by the way, another ethnic minority who just fumbled and fannied about when she was asked by Susan Hall about the grooming gangs in London. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And then obviously, you know, I don't say this with, you know, with nothing to support it. We've obviously now seen the Zoom meeting was Sadiq Khan back in 2020, where he was asked about grooming gangs in London. Is there any kind of investigation? Is he aware of any? And his response to that question, quite simple question, which was being asked, it was being put to him in his capacity as police and crime commissioner. His response was, "Are you asking me that because of my ethnic and my culture, my ethnic persuasion, my religious persuasion?" I don't have the exact words, but I mean, that was his concern. Are you asking me this because of my culture? And it was such a ludicrous deflection. And then the also Muslim chair of that entire meeting then, disallowed the question entirely. So it never got an answer. And I have to agree with what Ellie said. It feels like there are people there who are there for no other reason than to find out what is likely to be brought up, what is likely to be said, so that they can, further the cover up. And that is a shameful place for us to be in. The UK should be ashamed of itself. And it doesn't, I would still be saying all of this if the grooming gangs were white. I would. That's how I feel about these kind of grooming rape gangs in general. There is focus on an ethnicity because it is a key factor. These were specifically, almost entirely, men of Pakistani origin, and they were specifically targeting white girls and women. That was their target. And that is why addressing the race is important. It's not hateful. It is important. And if you're going to do these kind of inquiries and take this seriously and do justice for the victims, you have to be honest. Even if that is uncomfortable. Even if, like, you don't want to offend anyone and you're doing your best not to offend anyone because that's your nature, it still needs to be said. And the people of the sort of, ethnic and religious cultures who share that with these perpetrators but are not involved in this and are entirely innocent, they should be denouncing it. They should not have a problem with it being said out loud. And they should be calling it out. They should, so that should leave us in reality with the only people being offended are the actual perpetrators. But when you weigh up what's more important, the survivor's feelings or the perpetrator's feelings, I don't care about the perpetrator's feelings. They didn't care about the survivor's feelings when they were grooming them. So, yeah, all hell is breaking loose over this. I do expect it to continue to get worse. There have been mass calls for the resignations of Jess Phillips, Keir Starmer. I can't remember that lady's name. This one, Sabah Kaiser, the Home Secretary. It's all gone to shit. So, yeah, I'll see what happens, and I will do an updated video if I need to. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.